I'm Tanya Malnichuk of the Autistic Strategies Network, and this is Optimizing Autism, Part 1. The manner in which autism is defined and understood has a significant impact on autistic people and on the society in which they live. 2,000 years ago, Aristotle identified a group of people characterized by cognitive deficits, which he attributed to low body temperature. And for the next 2 millennia or so, the thinkers of the day, the great thinkers of the day, continued to expound and elaborate on what Aristotle had defined, and to explain why the impairments experienced by these people would mean that they would be extremely difficult to accommodate them in civic society. And yet, in spite of these obvious problems, in spite of the obvious deficiencies in muscle tone, vocal intonation, and mood instability experienced by these individuals, a few brave people from within this group began to rise up and say, we don't like being defined in this way. There's a name for this group of people. They're called women. Let's look at autism. Autism is characterized by red flags. By a quadrant of impairments, by deficits, by the kind of terminology we have here is a lack of something, obsessive, inappropriate. Yes, the inappropriate one is quite strange to me. Inappropriate use of toys. I've never seen the toy manufacturers actually put something in the box saying that you're not supposed to line up the toys. This is considered to be inappropriate. We're not supposed to be fixated about how the toys work. The toy manufacturers never tell us that we're not supposed to spin the wheels of the cars, that we're only supposed to use them as cars normally are. Somehow this is considered to be inappropriate. Now, if we take all of this to heart, deficits, quadrant of impairments, lack of this, obsessive, that, deficiencies, are you going to wonder why people have such difficulty with self-esteem? I actually know of an NGO where when they have discussions with the parents about all of these deficits and explain them to the child is sitting in the corner playing with toys, listening to this discussion. This goes into your soul. Now, let's take a look at where else this terminology is used. In employment. You plan to employ somebody who then notifies you that they're autistic, that they perhaps have the Asperger form of autism. What does the employer do? Okay, we're going to consider this. I can't remember what that thing is. Let's jump onto the internet. Let's go and take a look at the website. Let's go and take a look at the largest charity representing autism in this country and see what they say autism actually is. Quadrant of impairments, red flags, deficits. Are you going to want to employ that person? Does that make absolutely any kind of sense? I know a man who's married. His wife divorced him. Okay, so he's no longer married. His wife divorced him, and they had joint custody of the child. The wife is now thinking of moving to another country. He opposes this. He doesn't want to be in the position of not seeing his child forever. What does she tell the court? Her former husband has autism. So what should any judge really do to be able to decide this case? Go onto the internet, go and take a look what autism is about, go and find the red flags, the quadrant of impairments. Are you going to give custody to a man who qualifies, who fits all of those criteria on there? I don't think so. I don't really think that these things are doing us a lot of good. So what are we usually told we should do, given that we have this quadrant of impairments, these red flags, that we have all of these awful things? All right, to get your self-esteem back, the best thing to do is to try to overcome all of this. You can be the brave hero. You can model your life into that. You can, you know, be someone in spite of autism, and this is pretty much held up for us. You know, show how well you are coping and overcoming, and you know, perhaps we won't talk about cure. I was actually asked to be interviewed for a magazine once, you know, about how well I've overcome my autism. You know, I speak with a fairly modulated tone of voice. I have some body language. I seem to be able to hold my own in conversation most of the time, assuming I'm not having a meltdown, assuming I'm not in sensory overload, assuming I'm not temporarily mute at the time. But fine, all right. You see me right now in one of these states, which might well be considered to have be an example of how someone has overcome their autism. I haven't overcome anything. I'm not going to be anybody's hero. I'm not going to be anybody's role model. Every person is different. I'm me. And I certainly don't behave in this way to prove anything that can be overcome. If I'm not my normal autistic monotone self, speaking too fast, as I often do, and using body language which other people might consider to be quite inappropriate, it's merely because I respect the audience that I'm with at the time. If I'm with Xhosa-speaking people, I will attempt to speak Xhosa. If I'm with German-speaking people, I'll attempt to speak German to the best of my ability, with all of the cultural nuances which go with the language. I'm merely speaking the language, still being myself, but speaking the language of my audience. I asked them if they couldn't rather interview me on some of the positive qualities of being autistic, but no, that's not what this article was supposed to be about. I had to overcome my autism to be interviewed for the magazine, so I chose not to be interviewed. Autism doesn't only have green flags. And by the way, it has some green flags. Let's draw some. It seems to me that if you're going to advocate for autistic people, as soon as you identify anything positive, people are kind of cross with you because you're not recognizing all the bad stuff that can happen, and you're making life very difficult for the people who suffer from autism extremely, which tends to be the parents. So let me mention a couple of things I also don't like about being autistic. I don't like sensory overload. I don't like meltdowns. I don't like misunderstandings and rumination. I don't like attention problems. I don't like the physical problems which come from having the body which gives rise to this autistic mind. My eating habits sometimes perturb my best friend. I embarrass my colleague by introducing interesting but sometimes irrelevant information into conversations at work. That doesn't mean that I don't like being autistic. I like attention to detail. I like visual design. I like pattern recognition. I like stimming. Yes, I'm sorry, I like stimming. That's supposed to be there, right? We're not supposed to enjoy stimming. We're supposed to feel really embarrassed about it. We're supposed to not want to stim in public. We're supposed to want to hide this. This is supposed to be our deficit. Do you know this can be very enjoyable? Let me explain what stimming can be like on the dance floor. I've regularly been asked when I'm dancing, and I tend to dance alone, what I'm on, because other people want to buy this in small packets. They consider it probably contains a little white powder. I'm born this way. I get this high without having to actually take stuff. I don't have to mess up my body in order to feel good. I stim at airports generally whilst waiting for luggage, or whilst waiting to check in, or once I have my luggage and I'm pushing the trolley and I'm doing an arabesque whilst running with the trolley, or in the past when I didn't have ligament problems, actually hoisting myself up on the little bus which takes you to the aeroplane, and you can really swing. I saw a mother stopping a child once who was trying to do the same, and I was going, no, please don't stop him, that feels really good. This is autism. I asked some parents once at a recent workshop. In fact, I asked another group of parents at a conference last year, what was if they could, whether they could describe the unusual things about their child, about the children, which they really liked. And they began describing these unusual qualities. Unusual qualities: the child was unusually honest, the child was unusually creative, or the child was unusually inquisitive. And so it went on and on and on. Eventually I had to say to them, okay, stop, that's enough now. That's, okay, we're getting it. What were they describing? They were describing autism, green flags of autism. We're not supposed to like autism. Going back to Aristotle, some time after Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the early fathers of the church, he continued to write about women, continued to mention that women should be ashamed of being women. Women shouldn't actually even have orgasms because, they brought sin into the world. It would certainly not be anything to be proud of if you were a woman. Today, you get societies in which it's okay and it's acceptable to be a woman, in spite of the mood swings, in spite of the muscle deficits, in spite of the fact that I speak in a higher pitched tone of voice than my male counterparts. I'm right, I'm allowed to be a woman. I would like to be allowed to like being autistic. Let's talk about optimizing autism. If we take a neutral definition of autism, if we don't define it only as red flags, we have a couple of green flags as well. If it's neutral, if we identify that in spite of all of the differences one has, the multiple different kinds of autism out there, there are a few common things, there are a few common threads in our way of thinking, in our attention to the way in which things work, our love for either systems on a small scale or on a large scale. This is autistic thinking. We can take a look at how to make that better. When we use the word optimizing something, optimizing is always talking about a system, making interdependent parts work better together. If we take autism as a system, we can make these parts work better together. So let's look at the system. On the one hand, we have the individual, we have the person. Oh, that's supposed to be a person. Maybe I should give him some arms. Autism is inside everything. It's inside who you are. If you're going to make autism better, you're going to have to start working from the inside. There's also the interaction between the autistic person and the other people around, in education, in work, in society, and so on. So it gets bigger than that, but let's go right to the inside. I'm going to tell you a story. My friend Benji Gerber, and I'll write her name down because you're going to want to contact her at some point if you're interested in anything medical related to autism. So there we go. Benji is over 40, and for 40 odd years she suffered extremely from sensory overstimulation, a problem which plagues many autistic people classified with, in the old terminology, classic autism, all the different kinds of autism. You get some people who are, less sensitive, some people who are actually undersensitive, perhaps. But sensory overstimulation is a common problem in multiple senses. Things are too loud, things are too bright. Typical things we usually do to deal with this, if we are somewhat mature in our management, is we might use a weighted blanket. I have one. These things are really cool. They work very well. What else do we have? I have custom earplugs. These are designed for motorcyclists. This is one thing I do is I do not travel anywhere without these. And this was money extremely well spent. If you can't afford custom earplugs, you need to go for something else. This is You know, you should go without food rather than to go without earplugs. What else do we have? Oh, yes, brushing, of course. A specific kind of brush. My friend Benjean introduced me to this as well. This thing has some kind of like squeeziness to it as well. And she introduced me to the brushing technique. The books and the sensory specialists and everything, they didn't quite explain it properly, so I got the wrong brush before. Benjean had suffered from sensory overstimulation regularly for about 40 odd years. It messed up her relationships. It messed up everything. It made it very difficult for her to work. She would typically go out in public transport. She would come home sick, vomiting in pain through the night. Brushing helped up to a point. She would struggle to sometimes know where her limbs were in space. For her whole life, she could actually feel her heart beating. She was eventually identified as being autistic, put onto some kinds of medication, but as far as all of her physical problems were concerned, no tests really told anyone what the problem was. If anything, I think doctors were wanting to diagnose her with hypochondria. You know, you test the blood and you don't see anything there. She spent much of her life reading, studying, trying to get to the bottom of this, trying to do self-improvement courses. She actually even started some self-improvement groups at some point. She looked into medicine. She did a Coursera course on drugs in the brain. She did it to try to find out what was wrong. She eventually withdrew a lot more from society. I was very disappointed about that because she was quite a decent, supportive, kind person. And she said, I'm not even going to have online interactions with people anymore. I'm going to only see my clients and that's it. And then she sent me something one day. She said, I think I've discovered what my problem is. What she discovered is not really new. It's just buried between a whole lot of existing research and knowledge on the body. And it's the key to what ails us when we suffer from sensory overstimulation as autistic people. No amount of ABA, no amount of any kinds of therapies are going to fix this. There's actually an underlying medical, physical problem. Sensory integration therapy, things you're supposed to do with your ears, weighted blankets, all of these things. I have these as well, by the way. Okay. That's not it. That's external. And by the way, ABA is probably the worst thing that you can do to somebody who is suffering from sensory overstimulation. But of course, they never ask those people what it's really like to suffer through all of this. Let me explain what Benjamin told us. I'm going to go and fetch something. This represents a cell. Okay, so our bodies are full of cells, and most of the cells are some kind of amorphous, roundish things, except for neurons, of course, which are those things with the fingers and then a long thread and some more fingers. Right, so let's imagine this is a cell. Inside a cell, of course, one has, I think it's a cytoplasm, right, that mushy stuff. And then right in the middle, the nucleus, the stuff that contains the genetic material that expresses itself and sends messages to the rest of the cell, the rest of the body, to let it know what it's supposed to do. Okay, so imagine this is a cell. Now, why have I chosen something which has little holes in it to represent the cell? Well, this is what our cells are like. The membrane or the wall of the cell contains some apertures. It contains a couple of little holes. And these are called channels. In fact, they're called ion channels. And ion channels, because they allow ions to pass through them. So what are ions? Okay, I'm gonna give you some imaginary ions here. Let's say this is a potassium ion. So if it's potassium, I could write it as K plus. Right. Let's take a magnesium ion. Okay, so that will be Mg. That's also plus, right? Okay, shows you I'm not great at this stuff. What else do we have? We have sodium. And what's the other one? Calcium. Of course, we have, those are all cations. They've got positive charges. You get anions as well, chloride and so on. I'm concerned about the cations here for this explanation. What happens when we suffer from sensory overstimulation? We have a shortage of potassium inside the cell. And potassium can only go in when it travels through its own little channel, through its ion channel. The problem is that there's a bit of competition between these various ions. Potassium is friends with magnesium, and sodium and calcium kind of go together, and then we have a competition between sodium and potassium and magnesium and calcium. So here's the problem. For us to feel okay, for us to not suffer from sensory overstimulation, we need to have enough potassium inside our cells. Now, you can test somebody for, if they got enough potassium in their body, and the test might come back and say, yeah, you're kind of fine, because what they've discovered is there's enough potassium in your blood, which is supposed to be on its way to your cells, but it's not inside your cells. It may not have reached your cells in this part of your arm. It may not have reached the cells in the right place of your head. If you've got too much potassium, which reaches certain places, you could get a heart attack. It needs to be there in the right quantities, and it needs to be in the right places. What happens with sensory overstimulation? We have potassium somewhere. Well, sometimes we're low on potassium all over, but we have potassium, but it's not getting to inside the cells. And since potassium and magnesium are friends, it works like this. Magnesium says, okay, I'm going to go into the house. Now, I've got to find my channel. Where is it? There. Okay, right over there. That's a magnesium inside. And in fact, I like to represent magnesium with green because it looks like broccoli, and broccoli is my primary source of magnesium, or one of the main ones. Right, so we've got magnesium on the inside now. Only now will potassium be happy to go inside. So, okay, now potassium is going to go inside. Shows you. I was never really good at this stuff when I was a kid. Okay, you get the picture, right? Okay, potassium can go in when magnesium can go in. Now, if we've got the wrong kind of thing happening, for example, calcium is supposed to be sitting in our extracellular space. It's supposed to be on the outside. It's supposed to be, well, yeah, okay, be in some cells, but it's supposed to be in our bones. It's supposed to be in our connective tissue. It's not supposed to be in our flesh. So we're supposed to have a balance of potassium and magnesium on the inside, sodium and calcium on the outside. And sodium, in turn, is what gives us blood pressure. High sodium, you're going to have too high blood pressure. Low sodium, too low blood pressure. So you need that stuff to be on the outside. You need that to be coursing fast nicely. There's your blood vessel. And then you've got this stuff going inside. Magnesium first, then potassium. So what did Benjean do? She started taking magnesium. She started taking potassium supplementation, and she started feeling better almost immediately. She started emerging into society again. But she knew that something else was still wrong, because the quantities of potassium that she was taking, pharmacists were getting concerned. She buys this stuff and they said, you know what you could do. You could wipe yourself out. You drink 2 of these, you drink 3 of these, your life is over. And she was going, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. And she was taking quantities of potassium which were way, way higher than average, just experimenting on herself. Now, we have an emergency sensory overload regime, which would typically involve spraying some magnesium mouth spray so that you can at least be sure that the potassium will get in, and then taking some kind of powder. Typically at pharmacies one could buy, and supermarkets as well in my country, you can buy potassium chloride, which is a substitute for table salt for people who can't have high sodium. And then you'll dab it on your tongue. Of course, you still need to go and get into a dark corner and go and stim and do what you need to do. But you can at least start to alleviate this acute potassium shortage. What contributes to potassium shortages? certain medications. If you take methylphenidate, Ritalin, Concerta, that kind of thing, you'll urinate more frequently. So you'll get rid of potassium. And you'll be getting rid of other minerals as well. You need to top up with all of your electrolytes if you're on those medications. What else can do it? Risperidone, very commonly prescribed to autistic children, a very dangerous drug, can also cause hypokalemia. So that's just, the word for low potassium. So write this down. Hypokalemia. Okay, right. Okay, kalemia. You're depleting your potassium. What else can deplete your potassium? You could be under stress. Somebody annoys you. You get angry. And we were thinking of actually making a T-shirt at one stage based on something that Ben Sheen said. She said, if I get into an argument with someone, I just think, you're not worth my potassium. So, right. So in other words, cortisol, which is the stress hormone, causes our potassium to drop. So these are a number of things that can cause our potassium to be low. Supplementing with potassium clearly is not the answer. Benjamin took her research further, and I will call it research. It's a little bit different from, the average person searches Google and then they say they've done research. So they've researched Google. Benjamin will properly research something. She will write down her findings. She will compare them to a control situation, even when she's only working with a sample of one, which might be herself. And she does meta studies, so she will be writing down what she's found in other literature. She'll collate people's descriptions of things. So she went on to discover, and as I mentioned, some of this stuff is not new. A lot of this, what she is finding and what we're finding now along with it, is written up in autism research, but it's never turned into anything therapeutic. Oh, we discovered that, many autistic children seem to have methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase gene mutation. Isn't this terribly interesting? Okay, so this could lead to histamine problems. And then very few people take it further and take it all the way up to sensory overstimulation and go and connect it to that. What do we do to fix the problem, from the root? You can't always be taking massive quantities of potassium and magnesium as supplements. Something's wrong with the body that it doesn't actually get to the right place. Coconut oil, for example, to work with the cell membrane. Your cell membrane produces the channels, these ion channels. And by the way, drawing them like that with little holes is probably not the best representation, because they tend to be very thin little channels, only about a molecule thick, and each channel is then ion specific. And you may have, well, perhaps this is not a bad analogy, that for the same kind of ion you could have different kinds of channels. Some are gated in different ways, some are mechanically gated, some might be stimulated, for example, by hitting our cells, and it might draw the potassium there, and some of those channels are opened in different ways. If you want to look at the migraines, if you want to take a look at epilepsy, you'll find ion channels are involved in those things. Right, so what we want to do is we want to build the health of the cell wall, because that is what's producing the channel. The channel isn't an empty space. The channel is filled with a fluid. It's filled with something which the cell wall itself produces. We need to have good amino acids. We need to have good proteins so that our cell walls can build this. And we need to have, and I brought the coconut oil just because it's an example of something which makes it nice and slushy so that it's soft. If you've got rock solid cell walls, it's not going to produce the ion channels properly. So it goes beyond that. By now, Benjamin has a model where she's identified some of the role players there. We can have sensory overstimulation, for example, without anxiety, without the amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain, the part where our fight or flight response, all this cortisol is controlled. So there's that version of sensory overstimulation. We can have sensory overstimulation, which, and that, by the way, we call our sympathetic nervous system. We can have sensory overstimulation related to our parasympathetic nervous system. The other bodily functions, the bodily function that controls things like our eating and our digestion and so on. And if that dysfunctions, we also have sensory overstimulation, or we can have. And that needs to be treated properly. Examples might be that could cause that. Autistic people who commonly suffer from these things would who tend to have sensitivities to things like potatoes and anything from the nightshade family. So this means a dietary change so that you don't exacerbate your cholinergic dysfunction. Mindfulness can be helpful in controlling the amygdala part if you've got that version of sensory overstimulation. And then I mentioned the methylene tetrahydro, MTHFR, that gene mutation. Goodness, I have to remember this long word, all this, which is about histamine. So histamine intolerance is a common exacerbating factor as well in sensory overstimulation in some people. All of these things need to be addressed. You will therefore find that many of us are using techniques to adjust to those things. Now, does that mean that my friends and I have all had genetic testing to find out which of these genes are creating the situation? No, because we're not all that wealthy to be able to do these things. We pretty much go symptom-based, and then we try these things out on ourselves. So once Benjean had discovered some of these things and found that it could make a huge difference to the lives of so many people, she tried to get medical science, interested and involved in coming up with something therapeutic. It's of course not that easy to dose everybody, to provide everyone with a means to to get it into their own bodies. Many autistic people have stomach trouble, so if you don't sort that out, then nothing is going to go in and go to the right part of your body anyway, so it needs to distribute. She's looking at dosing mechanisms and so on. She started approaching some scientists and some people in the medical industry, and they just kind of felt this was a small problem, small part of the population, probably not a big deal. Not kind of knowing that millions of people in the world suffer from sensory overstimulation. Where she did finally get the interest was from the head of the Channelopathy Foundation. Okay, channelopathy, ion channels. So he flew out to our country, came and saw Benjean, and flew back and discovered upon his return that he was autistic too, which was quite a celebration for all of us. But we now started having interest. And Benjean is at the point now where we need someone to take this up as a proper medical study. We can't continue as we've been for the last year or so, distributing this information, actually speaking to parents about it, speaking to clinicians, speaking to an audience of people who deal with autistic people, speaking to autistic people themselves, without actually having trials done, formal trials, and more than just anecdotal evidence on what we're working with. We also need better delivery mechanisms to be researched. The University of Cape Town is willing to take on master's and PhD students to study this, not only for the next year, but for a number of years. And there are agencies which are prepared to fund research into this if we come with the proposals. So I'd like to ask you to do that if you have research contacts. There's a lot of research going on into autism. Not much of it is actually requested by the autistic community itself. If you believe that this is just coming from a bunch of Aspies, believe me, I cannot speak for every person, but I can tell you that a lot of people suffer from sensory overstimulation. Right now we're standing in an office. I'm recording this from within an office which has been customized for me, for my sensory requirements. Most autistic people don't have that. I wouldn't be able to work in this office if this hadn't been adapted to my sensory requirements. I wouldn't actually have this job. There are many autistic people who are in environments where they can't function properly because this is not done for them, and who have severe sensory problems. Please contact Benjean at Flaxus.net if you'd like to research this further.